Welcome to Enhancing Revit Model Performance through Model Maintenance with Ideate Explorer. My name is Richard Taylor with Ideate Software Tech, and we're just thrilled to have Olivia Morgan here today. Before I do my introductions for Olivia, I just want to mention a couple things. The webinar is being recorded, and so you'll have the link to that recording after the presentation. And myself and Naveen Nabil are going to be reviewing the question panel. So if you find that question panel and you type questions in, we'll try to answer those as best we can. Also, at the end of the presentation, about 10-15 minutes, at the end, we will have a Q&A session so we can have some of those specific questions for Olivia. So again, welcome. And we're just, like I said, thrilled to have Olivia Morgan today. Olivia Morgan is a professional corporate educator and design technology manager exploring the intersection of technology and fabrication. As a CAD generalist, Olivia has a broad understanding of a vast wealth of AEC software and interoperability workflows with a specialization in BIM management. In her current role at AECOM as a BIM manager, Olivia leads a large infrastructure projects with a focus on scan to BIM. Olivia is also a LinkedIn learning instructor producing courses on architecture and construction software, including her latest course on BIM management, Revit model maintenance, released this past July, focusing on methods to get the best model performance out of Revit. And in fact, what we've done in the chat, we've actually included the, I believe, the link to that LinkedIn learning course. So Olivia can expand a little bit more on that as we go forward. But we are just thrilled to have Olivia on our Ideate Software Tech webinar today, and I'm going to pass it over to Olivia. So I'm going to make sure the technology here, I'm going to see if I can make her presenter.
Thank you very much for that wonderful introduction. Okay, I'm going to show my screen. It's happening. Can everyone see what I'm doing here and also hear me?
Yes.
Awesome.
Perfect.
And I'm going to switch screens too. Can everyone see when I switch screens as well?
I can see the Ideate automation
Awesome.
dialog.
Okay. Awesome. Okay, exactly what I wanted to hear. Well, I'll go ahead and get started. Thank you so much for that wonderful introduction. I am here today to talk about Revit model maintenance, a topic I am really passionate about. And if you haven't heard of it already, Revit model maintenance is basically using best workflows and practices to get the best performance you can out of Revit. And the name of the game is usually element reduction and element organization within Revit itself. So the concepts I'm going to be covering today are a very abbreviated version of the concepts that I covered in my LinkedIn learning course. So if anything here today sounds interesting, definitely check out that LinkedIn learning course. I have a lot more time to delve into some of these topics. And a lot of the workflows that I show in this course, and obviously in this presentation today, are focused on how we can get the most out of Ideate Explorer and workflows that both BIM managers can use, but also just the average newer user to Revit can take advantage of to better understand their model. And the project file that I'll be using today is that same project file or exercise file that you can get in the LinkedIn learning course. And I was really excited to receive this file because it's a real working file from a firm in Norfolk, WPA Architects. And it's nice to get these real world files because they obviously have real world challenges to examine versus just a general exercise file that you might get, a training file. So to set the stage for our conversation today, I just wanted to first talk about model metrics. This is how we measure, in my mind, model performance. And this is basically the backbone to this presentation and the content in the LinkedIn Learning course. So as I mentioned earlier, element organization and element reduction within the model gets you better performance. And it's best to focus up on these top categories that I listed right here. These are the problem guys that show up in our model. And if they show up in our model in excess, they can cause problems. I'm sure people have worked on models that take forever to synchronize, take forever to open, and in the worst case possible, maybe take a really long time just to model out elements in a 3D view. Managing these categories within Revit prevents those issues from happening. And we want to track the number of these elements so that we have a better understanding of the current state of our model. And within this list, I also usually give a threshold to teams of numbers I want to see these elements be under. So this might be a little controversial to some of the people on the call. I'm sure other BIM managers have other numbers that they like to track. Maybe they think my views not on sheet is way too large, but I like putting a number to be under within each one of these categories because it really helps focus the team and strategize how we want to do cleanup. So if we're really over our warnings threshold that we set, it helps us prioritize cleaning up warnings versus if we really don't have a problem with in-place families, we don't need to focus on those numbers. So this is just a starting point to help focus up the team on what to strategize about when we're talking about maintenance and maintaining these numbers. So my Swiss Army knife to manage all of these numbers is Ideate Explorer, which we'll come back to again and again. And Ideate Explorer is such an amazing tool. When I first started using it, I kind of had a hard time understanding what it was used for. I thought it was just a project browser or a version of the project browser, but it's so much more than that. It gives you these automatic counts of all of these different categories and then some, basically everything that is placed in your project. And you can go down to the exact instance of each one of these elements. So immediately, I can already see I have too many imports in my model, which we'll get back to later. But this is the tool that I use to get that immediate gut check of my model. And in this presentation, I'm going to go through some basic workflows, but hopefully some more advanced workflows that maybe you haven't considered before, using this and other Ideate tools to get a better handle of our model. So in most cases, this is my starting point to understand the metrics of the model. But I also wanted to point your attention to other methods we can use to manage model metrics, and that is using the Ideate Automate tool. So if you haven't used already, Ideate Automate is a tool that can automatically run tasks on your Revit model. So these are things that can happen in the background, like publishing your model to BIM 360, getting metrics on Kobe, and so on. And the topic that we're going to be focusing on today is, you guessed it, the health metrics. So this task is something that can run on the background on multiple Revit models on a daily, weekly, and monthly basis. And it gives you an output of these numbers right here. So this is really nice because we don't even have to go through the process of opening up Explorer. We can automate checking on our model health, even if it isn't at the forefront of our minds every single day, right? So I'm not going to go through every single step here because it does require you to open up the model, and it takes a moment, but this is something, like I said, that can happen in the background. But I will show you the output of this program. So I'm going to X out of here. I'm going to open up my Excel document. Just checking everyone can see my Excel document too. I'm assuming so.
I had to unmute myself. Yes, it looks fantastic.
Yes, okay, very good. Just want to double check, you never know, I can just talk on and on. Okay, so this is the output that you get from Ideate Health Check, and you can see, this is the health check that I ran on this model, that we get a lot of these metrics that we were interested in: warnings, in-place families, and model lines, imports. You can see it's really aligned with the list that I have for myself. And we have these really nice red tiles here, and this is showing us when we go over these numbers, right? So as I mentioned before, I'm sure other BIM managers maybe have their own numbers that they want to track. Maybe they think my numbers are too high. This is something that you can actually set in the template file that Ideate runs on. So if you look at the pivot metric values here, I changed this to reflect my baseline and numbers that I don't want to go above. So, you know, I changed my model groups to no more than 50, model lines to no more than 100, and so on to get this red block summary right here. So this is really a great tool to customize what you want to track and what you want to see on a daily basis. Now, this Excel document in isolation isn't as helpful on a day-to-day if it's just packed away in a filing system, right? So we really want to use this as a communication tool to get the rest of the team involved and make them aware of these numbers. So I wanted to point you to a workflow you can use with Ideate Sticky to automatically get this information in your model. So here we have the splash screen, the screen that comes up whenever you open up this Revit model. And this is the canvas we can use to stick on our model metrics. So I'm going to use Ideate Sticky to do this. And I'm going to use the image version of this. and I'm going to link to the Excel document that we just created. So once again, imagine you're setting this up on a recurring schedule, and this Excel document is going to update your metrics as things change in your model. So I'm going to hit open, and we could view multiple things, but I'm going to focus on the summary here. Check that on. Hit OK. Very good. Awesome. And here's what we want to make sure we do. We want to check this auto update. So as that Excel document updates, so does the information in our metric summary. So I'm going to hit show here. Very nice. Okay. So this is great. Now we don't even have to think about generating these metrics. They just automatically come into the model. And it's also, once again, a really helpful communication tool with the rest of the team, because now even newer users to Revit can start to understand the rules of engagement with the model. They start to understand, oh, imports are bad. I didn't know that. Oh, the views on sheets, we're tracking that. It's a really great starting point to start a conversation with your team and also focus up how you look at some of these numbers. So really great workflow to set the stage for the team. Okay, now with that, let's switch gears and talk a little bit more about some of these individual categories. So in my LinkedIn Learning course, I basically have a video for each one of these topics and then some at the end for more BIM management topics. But I obviously don't have time to cover all of these topics here today in this presentation. So I wanted to talk about an isolated grouping. I wanted to talk about an isolated list here to focus up our conversation. And the items in bold, as you can see, are what we're going to talk about one by one. And I chose this list of elements because there's some really great workflows we can use with Ideate Explorer and other tools to manage these very quickly. And also, I think these are a particular problem area that I see in models, and cleaning them up really can immediately contribute to better performance versus some of these other topics which can contribute to performance but might not play as big of an impact. Okay, so each one of these topics I'm going to be covering in kind of a similar method. We're first going to talk about why it's an issue, when I usually see it in models, and how to fix it or clean it up. And finally, within each one of these sections, I also want to talk about maybe a more advanced workflow that you haven't considered with Ideate Explorer. So hopefully there's going to be content for everyone to enjoy, from new users to those who have been in the game for a while. Okay, so let's first talk about imports. All right. So why are imports such an issue? They are the bane of my existence, and they usually cause performance issues, from what I can tell, for two main reasons. First off, Revit isn't really optimized to handle non-native Revit geometry. I know, shocking. Not all Autodesk products work perfectly together, but it truly is the case. And secondly, usually when you import CAD elements directly into your model, you're bringing in a lot of extra junk. I'm talking about things like annotation elements, line styles, line patterns, and so on that are baked into the model and can be very hard to manage, especially if you were to select this import and explode it within the model, which is a big no-no, as many of us already know. So usually the solution depends on what the import is, right? So I usually see imports like this brought in, these CAD details, when a firm is either transitioning into Revit and they have a lot of these legacy details, or you're getting a cut sheet, like in this example, where you want to duplicate some of this information and you just want to bring it into your model quickly to put something on the sheet. So in this scenario, I'd almost always recommend never importing into the Revit project proper. We always want to make a new family. And if you must import something, at the very least, import it into a detailed item, like in this example, to kind of isolate all of that CAD information. It's a much more efficient way to represent CAD information as a family duplicated many times throughout a project. The second time I usually see this is if someone's importing a plan or a site plan, which would be better represented probably as a link instead of an import, okay? So just to really hammer home this point of extra junk and trash in your model, I wanted to point your attention to the Style Manager over here, which is a really great tool from Ideate that helps you get a better handle of all of your style elements in the model. And this does a lot of different things, but I think one of the coolest things it does is it's able to identify all of these different categories. And when certain elements like line styles have different names but the exact same properties, and this tool is able to merge those annotation elements together. So it's another tool in our toolbox to reduce elements in our model. But for today's conversation, let's just focus on line patterns here. I'm going to click on that. And here you can see all of our line patterns in our model. Ideate's able to, once again, identify if something has a different name, but maybe has the exact same line pattern here. So what I'm going to do is just search imports. Let's see what we get. Okay. Oh, import. There we go. So here we have a list of line patterns that we're probably never going to use and probably came in because we imported CAD elements directly into our model. So a few of these in isolation isn't that big of a deal, but all of these at once really clog up the model. And I think people, when they bring in imports, don't really understand the hidden costs of bringing these imports into the model. So I just wanted to point this out as a little PSA to all users that still don't have this concept fully ingrained in their head. So there you go. This is why I hate imports so much. I go into more detail of how to manage these in my LinkedIn Learning course, but this is just a starting point to start to think about some of these concepts. Next, I'm going to switch gears. Let's talk a little bit about groups, and I'm going to talk about detailed groups and model groups kind of in the same breath because they usually have similar costs in the model. So I usually see detailed groups crop up in the model during construction document phase. Maybe someone's made a beautiful detailed group in a drafting view, and then it's duplicated a million times by another user. That is not an efficient way to represent information in Revit. And for model groups, I usually see model groups crop up a lot during the beginning of the design and design development. And they usually, they often show up as these groupings of furniture, which I'm not necessarily against. I think using groups is a really efficient way to get design out quickly. The problem arises when we have these elements in excess. My usual rule of thumb is if I see a group exist more than 3 times or 3 instances in a project, it might mean that you want to either change this into something like a family or ungroup it. I think a lot of people make groups, forget about them, and they just become this bulky item in the model. And they're usually fairly easy to fix as well. So the reason that groups are usually an issue in a model is because they're not an efficient way to represent geometry, as I mentioned. A much more efficient way to represent geometry is usually as families, but they're usually fairly easy to fix, and I love using Ideate Explorer for this to really dig into what's happening here. So I'm going to turn that on. All right, and I usually, as a baseline, have my display set to entire project. It's going to show me everything placed in the project, and then sort by category to sort all of my elements in their specific category. And of course, we have a category for groups, and I scrolled right by it. I'm going to expand that. And we have a lot of groups in this model, as you can tell. It's taken a little bit. So we have about 1,000 detailed groups, over 200 model groups, and this is way above my target threshold. I'd prefer to see 100 or less detailed groups or 50 or less model groups in this model. And I can expand this even further and figure out what these individual placement groups are. And I wanted to point your attention to these array groups because I see these show up a lot, and they're usually a fairly easy win to get rid of out of the model. So if you don't know already, array groups are generated by default often when users select elements, they click array, and then Revit by default groups these elements together. I'm not going to run that right now just for the speed of this presentation, but I think users just need to be made aware that this array option automatically groups elements together unless the feature is unchecked. And I wanted to point it out here because Ideate makes it very, very easy to get rid of these guys. So just to hammer home my point, let's look at one of these. What I can do is I can check this on to get property information. Oh, and I'm actually going to deselect here for a bit because I had multiple things selected there. So I'm going to check this on. I can get property information about this array group. I can select it in the window, and I can get even more information, including the person who created it, which could be very useful. And I can finally double click on this element to get to a good view here. And here we go. We have a bunch of lines that have been grouped together. Probably not the most efficient way to represent a line here. So these are super easy to get rid of and a very easy win for the project. So in most cases, when I'm doing cleanup in the model, I see these array groups. I have no problem just selecting all of these guys. We have 144 and just ungrouping them. So this is just an easy win for the project. You probably get better performance out of reducing more complex groups, but sometimes when you're cleaning up a large model, it just feels nice to get rid of a bunch of groups that you know you don't need. Okay. And just a final word on the model groups. These are very easy to get rid of. In most cases, you can make this into a system family or ungroup it. So I've already made a system family to look at this. I have my component here, and looky here, I have a system family that looks almost identical to this guy. The only thing I changed was I made the chair out of Revit native geometry, so we have a smaller file to represent the chair as well. So the way we would fix this is edit the group. And I'm not going to go through this whole process because it does take a moment, but I can just replace this element here, super easy, and then delete the original geometry here. And that is going to replace 40 instances of this group. I'm not going to click finish here because this does take a moment and we have limited time together, but just know this is the method we would use. It would replace 40 instances immediately, and then all we would have to do is ungroup this element. So these can be really easy wins. And I'll hit yes, I do want to cancel. Okay. Next, let's talk about reference planes. I think this is something that is misused and misunderstood by a lot of users in the model, and I usually recommend having no more than 500 reference planes in the model, which sounds like a big number, but let me tell you, this number goes over all the time, especially on design projects. I've seen reference planes kind of misused within the Revit model. I've seen them used in place of match lines, and in some even worse cases, I've seen them in place of grid lines. Just use match lines and grid lines for those purposes. And I'll often see reference planes used in 2D drafting views, as you can see here, which isn't the best use case for a reference plane. So a reference plane carries a lot more information with it than the average drafting line. It has three-dimensionality to it. And when we place it in these 2D drafting views, we're not really taking advantage of all of the features of a reference plane. And in most cases, I would say reference planes have more use case in a Revit family than they do in the Revit project. So in general, I have no problem using reference planes for lining things up, right? Even in a drafting view. But the problem happens when people forget about these lines. So you can use these, in my mind, for lining things up, but just delete them out of the model after you're done using them, right? And if you really must keep a reference plane in the model, I would recommend giving it a good name and then pinning it in place, specifically in a 3D view, so you can take advantage of its three-dimensionality. So Ideate makes it very easy to delete these out of the model without a lot of heartbreak. So I'm going to go back to my Explorer window. Very nice. Once again, display set to entire project, sort by category. And I'm going to go down to my reference planes. There we go. So we have 202 reference planes. We're below my threshold, but there's still always room for improvement, right? And I wanted to focus on reference planes because they're a really easy win in the project as well. We have 202 weak references, and when I expand that even further, I get a list of the individual reference planes that are named. So I like this. I'm glad there's some reference planes in here that have a name. This is a good workflow. But we do have 197 reference planes that are unnamed. So usually when I do cleanup on a model, I'll let the team know I'm doing a cleanup. I'll let them know what I'm focusing on. I'd say reference planes, groups, and so on. But in most cases, I feel totally fine just checking on all of these reference planes in most cases and deleting them out of the model. But let's say, and then you're getting rid of a lot of these, right? But let's say you don't want to go scorched earth on your reference planes. You want to come in with a scalpel and have a more detailed, nuanced approach. Let's say you just want to get rid of reference planes that are in your 2D views. You know you don't need them anymore, right? So the way you could do that is using the filter option here. So I haven't talked about it too much yet, but filters here filter out what you see in your list. So here we could filter out and see only annotation elements, only model elements, and so on. And there's a few of them that I really like in here. Like you can filter out to only see in-place families, which is another big problem area for performance. But you can also make custom filters as well. And when you make a custom filter, you can make custom selections in your view. So let me show you what I mean by that. I'm going to make a custom filter that's just for reference planes. And to do that, I'm going to click on my little sprocket up here and go to Manage Rules. Okay. And I'm going to make a new rule. And I'm going to type in reference plane. Very nice. I'm going to hit Next. And at this point, I could even filter out even further. So basically, I choose other properties, and I could choose to filter by any of the properties associated by a reference plane, which is very, very, very nice if you really want to dig into a specific part or a specific type of reference plane. And this goes for any element within the model. You can make these rules. For our demonstration today, I'm just going to filter by reference planes and just make it like that without any properties. So I'll hit Save and Close. And we can see our new reference plane. I'll hit OK. So I find that this doesn't immediately filter out. I might have to hit the refresh button here. Okay, so I'm going to hit refresh. And that should work. That should activate my filter. Okay, there we go. So now our filter is activated, and you might think to yourself, oh, what was the point of this, right? Now we have a filter of just these guys. The reason I like doing this is because once you create a filter that's activated, you can use the filter selection tool. So Revit has this feature, of course, where you can select items and filter things out of them, but Ideate allows you to preemptively filter things. So I only want to select reference plane. So what I can do is just click this on, and now my selection is only locked to reference planes. So now what I can do is just go through all of my drafting views and use this preemptive selection tool to just delete out the reference planes that aren't having as much application in these 2D views, right? So this is a very quick way to preemptively start to clean up elements in your model. But sky's the limit with these filters. You can filter by a lot of other categories as well, as I mentioned. So this is just a starting point to start to think about how you might use this feature in your own workflows. Okay. Let's next switch on to views not on sheets. Okay. So I usually recommend having no more than 1,000 views not on sheets, and within this number, not all views are created equal. So in my own Revit projects, I would only want to see 2 types of views. I want to see views that are going on sheets. They have a specific purpose, and I want to see working views. And the problem arises when we have a lot of views that people forgot they made, and they're just, fat in the model, right? Unnecessary. And some views play a bigger role in performance than others. So for instance, 3D views usually have a higher performance impact than other views. And these have performance impacts whether or not you have the view open. They can sometimes cause the model to open up more slowly, synchronize slowly, once again, even if they're not open. And the 3D views that are a particular problem area are usually the ones that show a lot of 3D elements. They have a fine detail level, and they have a lot of specific graphic display options. So these have a lot of hidden costs. I've even dealt with projects before where one 3D view was preventing us from publishing to BIM 360. So there's a lot of weird oddities that can come with excess 3D views. Now, if you really must keep a 3D view in your model, at the very least, I would recommend working with your visibility and graphic overrides to turn off elements that you know you don't need. So for instance, I don't see any furniture in this view right now, right? But it is turned on in the view, and it does have a processing cost. So I would go through my visibility and graphics and turn off elements that I know I won't need to see. So just one way to clean these up if you truly can't delete them out of the model. So Revit has a method to filter out views not on sheets. You can select this top category view, and it's now set to all. I can see all my views, but we can change this to not on sheet. And now I have a reduced version, and I'm only seeing views that are not placed on sheets. So I could go through and select these and look through them and delete them, but a better method I like to use is using Ideate Explorer. You guessed it. And when I use Ideate Explorer, it allows me to get a little bit more data about my views while I'm looking through them. And it allows me to select multiple views at once in multiple categories versus in the project browser where I can only select category by category at once in groups. So we're at display entire project, sort by category, and just for the heck of it, why don't we put on a filter? I'm going to put on a filter for annotation because we're only looking at annotation elements, including views. So this can focus up what we see, and you usually get a little bit of better performance out of Ideate, I find, when you use these filters or enact them at first. Okay, here we go. So I can scroll down to views. I have 1075. We're pretty low below my threshold, but let's take a closer look. So we only have 300 views not on sheets, not too bad, but always room for improvement, like I said. So let's take a closer look. And once again, we have our list that's organized fairly similarly to view type here, and we get the instance counts of these views as well, which is very nice. So I usually focus on 3 types of views to get started. I focus on my 3D views to reduce them. I then look at my section views, and then I finally look at my drafting views. And I specifically focus on views that are not well named. And in my LinkedIn Learning course, I get into this a little bit more, but usually the preventative method of making sure your views don't get out of hand is really good browser organization and communicating that organization to the rest of your team. So as I mentioned, I usually look at my 3D views first, specifically these views that are not well named. Usually people create these and forget that they are created in the model, right? So this happens pretty frequently. We need to get people in the habit of creating views that they need, labeling them well, or creating them temporarily and deleting them out of the model. I also look at sections because the sections can get really out of hand. People usually use them to model out 3D elements, but then once again, forget that they're in the model. So these are usually an easy win here to get rid of. And finally, I look at my drafting views. And the reason I like to look at drafting views, especially when we're getting closer to the end of final construction documentation submission is because when you delete the view, you're not just deleting the view itself, you're deleting all of the view-specific annotation elements within it. So as I mentioned, I do this probably closer to final construction documentation versus the beginning of the project. Maybe you want to use these views eventually in your project, but usually it's a good thing to double check because these have a lot of extra stuff in each one of these views. Okay, so as a BIM manager going through these workflows, we know that we haven't created all of these views, right? There's lots of people that contribute to model health, and model maintenance really should be the collective act of everyone on the project. So what I really like about this tool is that I can get a lot of information about who's creating certain elements. So for instance, if I want to dole out efforts to clean up the model, there's this really nice tool where I can select the questionable element at hand. So now I have all of my views not on sheet selected, and then I can export this information to an Excel document. And what is nice here is that it shows a lot of information, but it also shows who has created the view, right? So I'm going to export this and show you a few more steps. I'm going to hit save. And I'm going to say, yes, I do want to open up my view. Oh, it opened up on my other screen. And here I have my Excel document, and what I do next is I just take all of this information, I format it as a table, and my table does have headers, so I'll check that on, hit OK. And now what I can do is filter by created by. And there's a few ways to filter by created by the way, but I like exporting this document because now I have a list of elements to produce to someone. So obviously, this isn't a real working project. I saved as this model as central, so we only have one user here in this list. But if this was a real active project, I would have a list of users here that have created views, and I could check on one user and get an isolated list of all of the views they created. And I could also see who's creating the most views, who's creating the most views that aren't well labeled too, right? So what I'll try to do is present this isolated list to the user and say, hey, could you take a second look at these views and either clean them up or give them a good name, because I'm going to be doing a view purge at the end of the week. Just make sure you label all of the views that you want to keep, okay? So this is a really great way to give ownership over the elements people create, because sometimes people create elements in Revit and then they completely forget about it. And this is a really great communication tool to democratize this cleanup effort a bit. And like I said, there's a lot of different ways to get that information out of these elements that created by. This was just one method I used. Okay. So the last topic on our docket to talk about are warnings. And this should be a fairly simple, straightforward topic. So we obviously have warning tools within Revit itself under the Manage tab, but Ideate has a much nicer interface to better understand our warnings. So we've mostly been focusing on the Explorer tab here, but I wanted to point your attention to the Warnings tab over here. And this is such a nice interface. I think when I first started using this tool, I became a better manager because I started to conceptualize the cost or the related cost to each one of these warnings. So usually the warnings that are placed in red usually have a bigger performance impact, and the warnings that are put in green or white sometimes, those have less of a performance impact. So this is a really useful way to prioritize how we address warnings in the model. So if I can focus on these top category red warnings, I'm going to get much better performance output than if I were to focus on some of these green warnings. So in general, warnings that deal with geometry calculation are going to have a bigger impact on performance, and warnings that are focused up on annotation related stuff usually have less of an impact. But these are just suggestions made by Ideate for top warnings to look at. You can actually edit these warnings even further in how they're displayed within the project. So let's say, for instance, you're trying to create an existing building, and part of the contract obligation is to make sure all of the room numbers are correct. So if that is the case, something like elements have duplicate X value might actually be more important to you. So you're able in the back end to reprioritize this list of elements. So the way you do this is you go to your sprocket again, go to manage warnings, and I'm going to search for that warning. Okay, here we go. And it's ranked as green, so I'm going to right click and I'm going to make that high and hit save, and it is reorganized. Hit close. So imagine you're working with a larger team, you're trying to prioritize how you address warnings in a model or just clean up in general. Other users looking at this now have a priority list to focus up their time. And time is such a valuable thing, obviously, in our day-to-day. So finding ways to save it is a top priority for me. And doing model maintenance practice like warning management and just element management in general is going to give us better model performance and give us back that extra time in our day. So with that, I'm going to wrap up this side of my presentation and hand it back over to questions and Richard, who also has a topic that he might want to talk about, a presentation he might want to talk about. But I just wanted to thank the Ideate community here today for allowing me to present. The Ideate team has just been wonderful to work with. So thank you very much, and I'm open to questions or whatever else we want to present on for the rest of this.
Olivia, this is Richard. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, I can.
Okay. Actually, there was a good question. I know Naveen actually answered it, but there was a question on like model groups versus assemblies. Do you have any thoughts on that? Let me see if I could find the exact question. It was like both of them are sort of problematic.
Yes.
Yeah,
Oh
assemblies.
man.
Okay.
Yeah. So I have a little less experience with assemblies. I've actually been enjoying assemblies because at the very least you can schedule the information within assembly, and you can't really do that as well with groups. But I'd say groups are kind of the the worst option out of the two. And yes, assemblies in excess can cause performance issues, but I'd say model groups and detailed groups are a much less efficient way to represent information. But it depends, like not everything's going to need to be an assembly in a project, right? That's a very specific like use case, right? I wouldn't have an assembly of furniture usually.
And then I think there was sort of a concept that Dylan brought about a CAD container, like meaning that you would have a separate Revit file that would be
Mm-hmm.
your CAD container that would actually contain
Ah,
all of
yes,
the
yes.
particular imports. So you have any thoughts on that?
I'm not against it. I've used it before. Yeah, we're playing with fire here.
Yeah.
Well, I'm not against it. I think sometimes we are handed like CAD information that we need to incorporate into a model, and we just don't have any better information to incorporate into that model. So if we really must include that type of like non-native Revit geometry, at the very least, we're isolating it in a separate Revit model, I suppose, for the time being. But my hope is that like when you do use this method, the plan is to get rid of those imports eventually. But yeah, we're kind of packaging our potential problems in that Revit model, right? So that we can get better performance out of our like quote unquote clean Revit model. So I'm not against it. Depends. Everything depends.
Okay. Actually, I don't want to. Naveen, was there any other questions that you felt like the greater group would have a be valuable to answer?
Hey, thank you. Thanks for the presentation. I loved it. I appreciate it.
Oh, thank you.
So question that I saw that just came in, is there a way for us to fix duplicate values, warnings? So there are ways if elements are on top of
Yeah.
each other,
Mm-hmm.
retain original or retain latest, and we look at the element ID, and that's done through Ideate Explorer. And so if you know the duplicates just happened and a lot of things just got duplicated, like mullions or furnitures on top of each other. And so you can pick to, let's say, retain your original ones. And then it will tell you a list of things that will get deleted. And so you don't have to go through each element one by one and do that kind of work. So I really appreciate that. There was another question about the warnings level that are associated in the model. So if you had set up the warnings in your model and you ran an automated process, which has, let's say, different priority, that automated process looks at the external location that you've set up. And you can, let's say, edit that XML and distribute it among your team, and everyone can use that XML file for the priorities. So that's a really good question. You can determine what's a high priority, rank warnings, low or medium.
Yeah, and actually, while Naveen's talking, hopefully, can you see the screen?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. And if I, for instance, I think I have, let me go to the warnings here. Notice that there is one, as she was talking about, there are identical instances in the same location. So that was the question. And you can say you can retain originals or you can retain latest. So that's something that you could sort of fix. And then again, with the settings here, you can specify where these files are located, and then they can be saved in a central location, so everyone within the project has the ranking files or the metric files for the warnings. All right, anything else, Naveen?
I'm loving all the questions. They
Yeah, I know
keep
there's a lot of
coming.
questions coming in now.
So there was a question, does Ideate Explorer tool provide the ability to get family files or just the count? So we do have a script in Ideate Automation that allows you to extract information about the families. And these families can either be in a project location or a library path, and it exports a lot of information about these families. So it's not directly information extracted through Ideate Explorer.
Exactly. But I also wanted to mention that I'm going to be doing a very similar, maybe expanded a little bit more, on the model health check. It's in Australia. It's at the BILT, which is the Building Industry or Infrastructure Lifecycle Technology Show. That's going to be in Melbourne, Australia on September 5th through the 7th. So I have a presentation that's going to be understanding the key metrics within a comprehensive Revit model health check. So again, kind of drilling down and focusing on some of those metrics that Olivia was talking about today. And so, again, my objectives for this presentation is understanding the key metrics, understanding various methods that you can use to extract that, which would be, in our case, Ideate Automation, and then also understanding, what needs to be done to sort of fix those problems, because we want them to be very actionable and something that you can actually, like I said, for warnings, use Ideate Explorer to go and fix those warnings. Another thing I know that Naveen is very passionate about is the health check and the Power BI. So in addition to exporting information to Excel, you can also export information via Power BI template that we have. And so here's an example showing some Revit model health check where it's the same information, but it allows you to sort of put it in a nice dashboard where, as you see, we have views not on sheet, model lines, detail groups, average, annotations per issue, CAD imports, in-place families, and so forth. So if this is something that's of interest to you, we have a number of resources on our website about using the Power BI template with Ideate Automation. There is a very short survey. So once you exit the main GoToWebinar platform, it'll ask you for this survey. And we really appreciate if you just take a few seconds to answer those questions. There's only 4 questions. We've tried to keep it really short. It does help us focus the information for future webinars, and that's one of the questions that we ask you about, what you'd like to see. But also, I put in a couple questions there about, what of all of the fantastic things that Olivia presented today, what kind of was the top thing in your mind, or that you're going to be using maybe immediately for cleaning up some of these Revit model maintenance workflows. So again, I'd really appreciate if you just spend a few minutes to fill out that survey. All right, with that, I think we're a little bit over. I think we were supposed to be about 45 minutes. So I want to just thank Olivia so much for the presentation. It was fantastic. It's so much good information. And I also want to direct people to the chat where there's a link to her course, her LinkedIn Learning course on Revit model maintenance. So hopefully people can see that.
Yeah, thank you so much for this time to speak. This is a topic I'm really interested in. And I'd also encourage anyone who wants to chat more about this, reach out to me on LinkedIn. I'm at Olivia C. Morgan. Happy to chat more, talk shop more. And yeah, thank you so much for this opportunity.
Our pleasure. Well, everyone, thank you so much for your time and attention today. We really appreciate it. And I'll go ahead and close down the webinar and make sure you fill out that survey. And thank you so much.